Chapter 10. Jack squeezed the tube and a dollop of cream splattered onto his hand. He rubbed the sticky substance into his face and worked it around the back of his neck. His skin cooled for a second as it soaked in, leaving tiny goosebumps on his flesh. As he kneaded, he caught sight of his pale, shiny face in the mirror hanging in the porch. The red patch behind his right ear had grown bigger, and it was clearly visible, spreading out over the top of his ear and into his hairline. His heart gave a sickening thud as he examined the layer of crusty old blood covering the center of the blotch. He must have been scratching it during the night. He grimaced as his fingers accidentally brushed over the sore, causing a piercing pain to shoot along the outside edge of his ear. Wiping the excess lotion onto the back of his hand in practiced sweeps, he tried to push back the gloomy thoughts that kept popping into his head. Jack glanced out of the front door. Auntie Lil stood by the curb. Next to her, read Minnie. She gave one final buff the bonnet with the soft cloth and then stepped back to admire it. The perfect paintwork gleamed in the morning sunlight. "Let's go," called Beth as she bounded out of the house and settled into the front passenger seat. Jack, to his relief, climbed into the back behind Auntie Lil. At least sitting there, he wouldn't be tempted to wrestle the steering wheel out of her hands. Auntie Lil didn't know how to drive. Not really. That was what Jack thought anyway. What with the grinding gears, jerky starts, and driving at about 0 miles an hour, it was impossible to see how they were going to get anywhere. Beth seemed jumpy. As he watched, she picked a dry flake of skin off her bottom lip. A drop of blood bubbled up, which she quickly licked away. A muscle in her jaw twitched as she stared fixedly out the window. What was her problem? She was acting so weirdly. Uneasy feelings simmered along the big breakfast inside his belly. When Auntie Lil finally drew to a shuddering halt outside the station, Beth sprang from the car without a word of thanks and vaulted up the steps. "She's in a hurry," commented Auntie Lil. "Is she all right?" Yes. Thanks for the lift," said Jack awkwardly. "We'll make our own way back later." Auntie Lil fumbled in her handbag and produced a 20-pound note, telling Jack to go and enjoy himself. "Cheers, Auntie Lil," said Jack as he pocketed the money, glad to have some extra cash to add to his dwindling supplies. He adjusted his hood, hopped out of the car, and sprinted towards the main entrance of the bus station. The concourse hummed with the sounds of engines and chatter of passengers milling around. There was no sign of Beth. As he sauntered around, his eyes were lazily drawn to a bus which had just arrived. The passengers were clambering down the steps and picking their luggage up from where the driver was unloading it. As his eyes swept over the passengers, his heart skipped a beat. A familiar-looking gray-haired old lady scuffed down the steps. It can't be. Surely Mom hadn't sent Mrs. Roberts to keep an eye on him. Jack started in the direction of the bus. Then he stopped. What was he doing? He was being paranoid. Of course it wasn't her. Even Mom wouldn't go that far as to send a neighbor to look after him. There was more than one gray-haired old woman in the country. Anyway, he had more important things to worry about. He turned on his heel to continue his search for Beth. He eventually spotted a tiny handwritten poster with the words "Lost Property" on it. An arrow pointed to a nearby door, the glass panel smeared with marks and fingerprints. He pushed it open and entered a small windowless room with a row of stackable plastic chairs lined up along the wall to his left. A single poster was stapled to a cork notice board with the warning, "You are being watched," and a drawing of a giant hand pointing out of the poster towards him. As he moved further into the room, the finger seemed to follow. The back of his neck tingled. A wooden counter with an ancient computer standing on it ran along the width of the room. Behind the counter, an archway led into the storage room with the shelves stacked high with bags, suitcases, and other items people had left behind. Beth was standing at the counter. "They've found it," she said as she spotted him, her smile stretching across her face. Whatever was in the rucksack, she was very happy to get it back. "Here you go," a man appeared from the storeroom and dumped her rucksack on top of the counter. Careful, Beth seized hold of it, glaring at the man as she did so. Jack couldn't help remembering how she'd snapped at him when he tried to pick up her bag. This man wasn't being treated any better. "What have you got in there? Rocks or something?" The man muttered a few words under his breath and then grabbed a clipboard and pen. Beth scrawled her name where he pointed. He tore off the top copy and handed it to her. "Your receipt." With the man looking on suspiciously, Beth hauled the rucksack off the counter and crouched on the floor, undoing the zip as she did so. She peeped into the small gap she'd made. Jack peered over, trying to get a glimpse of what was inside, but Beth was too quick for him. With a decisive twang, she pulled the zip shut, stood up straight, and slung the bag over her shoulder. The jittery feeling was back again, but he did his best to shrug it off. What did it matter what she kept in her bag? It was none of his business. Now she had it back, and at least they could concentrate on finding Dad. All the same, he wished she'd stop being so secretive. "Let's go to Cafe Manon," he said. "We can talk there." They left the station and dashed over to the shady side of the market square beside the medieval church. On the cobbles in front of the cafe were 3 or 4 metal tables already occupied by people enjoying the early morning warmth. Inside, it was still cool and practically deserted. An old couple sat by the window sipping cups of tea, and a bearded man read the newspaper by the counter. Jack whipped out the 20-pound note Auntie Lil had given him. "I'll have an orange juice since you're paying," said Beth, giving him a cheeky grin and taking a table near the door. "I need to keep away from the glass," said Jack, gesturing towards the back of the cafe. "Reflective light." "Oops, sorry," she said, and moved tables. Jack ordered the drinks and then carried them over, setting them on the blue and white checkered plastic cloth. Beth held her rucksack on her lap. "She's scared to put it down," thought Jack, as he pushed the vase of fate flowers out of the way. Beth took a sip of her drink and then banged the glass down. "Right, let's get to work." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "We need to get on with investigating bioscience discoveries." Jack sighed. "What's the point? Dad left 14 years ago, and Auntie Lil said he'd never go back. Where are you going?" Beth had stood up. "Back in a sec." She went over to the counter and started talking to the woman behind it. A minute later, she returned and slid back into her seat. "According to the waitress, the best person to talk to about bioscience discoveries is Ted Harris. He left there 3 years ago. He left there years ago, so he's more likely to spill the beans." Beth reached and grasped Jack's wrist, pulling it roughly to inspect his watch. "And he should be coming in here in the next half an hour. All we have to do is wait." She lifted her glass and slurped some juice through the straw. It wasn't long before Beth pointed through the window at a figure on the pavement, pushing a yellow cart loaded with assorted brushes. She jumped up from her seat and was out the door before Jack could move. He slapped his drink down and hurried after her. "Ted Harris?" said Beth as she approached the man. "Who's asking?" The man put a hand to his mouth and wiped his lips. "I'm Beth. That's Jack. We've been told you used to work at Bioscience Discoveries." "What are you interested in that place for?" said Ted, looking shiftily over his shoulder. His voice was deep and grating. Up close, Jack saw the dirt on his clothes, his long hair and beard matted and greasy, and his fingernails blackened with grime. When he moved, a sour odor wafted past Jack's nose, the stench of someone who hadn't had a bath at any time in the last month. Jack's mind went blank. No help came from Beth. Her power of speech seemed to have temporarily abandoned her. She stood with her mouth clamped firmly shut, probably to avoid inhaling the smell. "What's in it for me if I talk to you?" Ted rubbed a grubby finger across his lips. "A cup of coffee," said Beth, finally finding her voice in the calf. "And a bun?" The shadow of a grin appeared on the man's face. Jack caught a fleeting glimpse of stained teeth. Beth nodded and they went back inside to their table. This time she squeezed next to Jack, leaving the other side of the table for Ted. As soon as he had his coffee and iced bun in front of him, Ted glanced across the table at them. "If you youngins know what's good for you, you'll stay well clear of that place." "What? Why?" asked Beth. The man let out a short, bitter laugh, which turned into a hacking cough. Jack jerked his head back, but wasn't quick enough to avoid a strong whiff of the man's stale tobacco breath hitting him squarely in the face. "I used to work there," the man said, once he had managed to clear his lungs, "a long time ago. Couldn't stand it any longer. Had to leave. It's better to sweep the streets. Strange thing to go on there. Bad experiments. Can't say no more." Ted shuddered and glanced over his shoulder again. "They got spies everywhere." "Spies?" Despite himself, Jack's eyes followed the man's gaze. "See them over there? They could be spies. Or her," he pointed at Beth. "She could be one." "She's not a spy," said Jack. Beth glared at the man. "Listen." The man jabbed the table with a grubby finger as if to emphasize the point. "Spies can be anyone, like you or me. Your neighbor might be a spy, or your gran. Think about it." "Thanks for that. We'd better get going." Beth glanced at Jack, rolling her eyes in the direction of the door. "And that Blackstone," Ted tapped a temple with a forefinger. "Powers made him crazy." He stuffed the remainder of the bun in his mouth, gulped down his coffee, and got up, shuffling towards the door. "Wait," called Jack. The man paused. "The papers. They'll explain it all. I gave 'em everything I had." The door banged shut as the strange man walked out. Jack and Beth were left staring at each other, open mouthed. The waitress came over and started clearing the glasses away, clicking her tongue as she did. "Poor Ted, he comes in here every week." The waitress paused in wiping of the table. "They accused him of giving secrets away, though what secrets Ted would have." She shook her head, looking mystified. "He was a cleaner." She bustled away, and Jack and Beth sat looking at each other in stunned silence. "Is he nuts?" asked Jack eventually. "Or do you think he was telling the truth about bioscience discoveries?" "No idea," Beth shivered, "but there's something going on at that place. First, we find out your dad left there in a hurry, and now Ted's warning us off. Shame we didn't have a chance to ask him if he had ever met your dad." And what did Ted mean by look in the papers? What papers? The newspapers, you numbskull. There's one place we can find some answers. Where? The library. They're bound to have a computer. She stood up and swung her rucksack over her shoulder, catching the vase with the trailing strap. Jack stretched out a hand to try to steady it. The vase teetered and then crashed to the floor, shattering into tiny fragments. The waitress hurried over with a dustpan and a brush as Beth, face beetroot with embarrassment, scuttled around picking up stray pieces. There you go. The waitress gave a final sweep and sped off to deposit the shards of glass into the rubbish bin. She returned with a new vase and carefully replaced the artificial flowers. Let's get out of here before I do any more damage, said Beth, her face still pink. Wait a sec, said Jack. He couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. What's with you in that bag? What have you got in there? A hoard of stolen money? A headless corpse? What? It's nothing. Beth clutched the rucksack tightly. Look, he was getting irritated with Beth for acting so mysteriously. We need to clear this up, right? I've trusted you with a lot of stuff about me and my family. You should know by now if you can trust me or not. If you don't, maybe you should go back home straight away, because I don't want to hang around with someone who keeps secrets. A long pause followed. He started to wish he hadn't said anything. Now he was worried he'd upset her. He licked his lips nervously and took a swig of juice. All the time, he was aware of Beth's gaze on him, as she was weighed something in her mind. After what seemed like an eternity, she sat back down and hauled the rucksack onto the table. She undid the zip. Slowly, she lifted two wooden boxes out and placed them in front of him. The boxes were identical, each one roughly the same size as a large box of tea bags. They were made from a cheap-looking, light-colored wood and covered with crude carvings of leaves and flowers. They looked, to Jack, like they'd been knocked up in somebody's shed. A brass plaque was screwed on the front of each. Gingerly, he picked one of them up and almost dropped it. It was heavy. Don't, said Beth, snatching the box from him and placing it back on the table. The waitress looked over at them. They're precious to me, hissed Beth. I don't want them damaged. What are they? She fumbled with the clasp of one of the boxes and opened the hinge lid. It flipped back onto the tablecloth with a soft rap. Jack craned forwards to peer inside. What the?